It is July of the year 1636 off the coast of Block Island in the colony of Rhode Island, and the ship is under attack. The colonist crew and captain, John Oldham, are quickly dispatched by Native American attackers. The colonial governments of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut blamed the Narragansett, but the murderers themselves escaped and found refuge amongst the Pequot. Before the time of English contact, the Pequot and Mohegans were one people, but they split into rival groups as the Mohegans became independent. By the 1630s, the Pequot were expanding aggressively into the lands of their neighboring nations as they were competing for shares in the fur trade. The colonists initially had landed in New England to witness the aftermath of horrific epidemics of European diseases, with many towns and villages depopulated. However, they began a tenuous alliance with the Wampanoag leader Massasoit, who made his main village at Mount Hope in modern Bristol, Rhode Island. Meanwhile, the Dutch had been expanding along the Hudson River. Tensions between the colonists and the natives of southwest New England began to rise in the early 1630s. Tensions grew more when Massachusetts Bay Colony became a major producer of wampum, which the Pequot and Narragansett controlled the market for before. Trade relations between the Pequot and Dutch had also broken down into outright war in the early 1630s. In 1634, an Englishman named John Stone was attacked and killed along with several of his ship's crew by the Niantic, a tributary nation to the Pequot. Stone had abducted two Niantic and forced them to act as guides up the Connecticut River, prompting a larger group to attack Stone's ship. Despite this, and general reactions to his death being indifferent, as Stone hadn't had the best reputation, the government of Massachusetts Bay felt it was their duty to seek retribution. Pequot Sachem sent wampum to the colonists, but refused to send the killers to stand trial. The killing of John Oldham in July of 1636 off the coast of Block Island became the subject of sermons throughout Massachusetts and Plymouth Colonies. And in August, Massachusetts Governor Henry Vane sent a party of 90 men, led by John Endicott, to seek revenge on the natives of Block Island. The English attacked two apparently nearly abandoned villages, with 2 men being hurt. While the colonists claimed to kill 14, later Narragansett reports only list 1 casualty. Endicott then attacked a Pequot village in Connecticut, demanding Stone and Oldham's killers, but the village was abandoned, so they burned it. In the aftermath of Endicott's expedition, the Pequot rallied their allies, but only convinced the western Niantic to join them. The Mohegans, Narragansett, and Wampanoag allied with the colonists. The Pequot laid siege to Fort Saybrook in modern Connecticut and started attacking towns throughout the region. While the siege lifted in spring of 1637, attacks on towns ramped up. In May, many Connecticut leaders met in Hartford to raise a militia of 90 Englishmen, led by Captain John Mason, and 70 Mohegans, led by their sachem, Uncas. The militia traveled to Fort Saybrook, where 20 more men, led by John Underhill, joined them. Then they were joined by 200 Narragansett. The group then marched near the mouth of the Mystic River to lead a surprise attack on one of the Pequot's main fortified villages. In the pre-dawn hours of May 26, 1637, the colonial forces, along with their Mohegan and Narragansett allies, attacked the Pequot town. 20 soldiers managed to break through the palisade, but were quickly overwhelmed, setting fire to the town to escape. Following this, the village began to burn, and any who escaped were killed by the soldiers outside. Captain Mason called the attack an act of God. Of the 500 Pequot in the town, only 14 survived, 7 of which were taken prisoner. The Narragansetts and Mohegans were horrified by the actions of the English. The Narragansett even attempted to leave, but rejoined the force upon figuring out the Pequot were setting up ambushes. The trek back saw skirmish after bloody skirmish, as the Pequot kept attacking, but the colonist force escaped Pequot territory. Following the Mystic Massacre, the spirit of the Pequot were broken. Sassacus led 400 in a trek west to seek refuge with the Mohawk. However, Mason and Uncas caught up with Sassacus at a Metabesic village near modern Fairfield, Connecticut on July 13th. The English allowed 180 elderly men, women, and children to surrender. The 200 Metabesic were also allowed to leave. Around 100 warriors stayed with Sassacus. The fighting continued into the night. The Pequot held their position, however, until a fog rolled in the following morning. Sassacus was able to break through a weak point in the English line and continue his escape to the Mohawk. Those who surrendered were sold into slavery. Sassacus finally made it to the Mohawk with his remaining followers, only to be killed along with his surviving men. The head and hands of Sassacus were sent to Hartford. Only 200 Pequot survived, and they did so by joining the Narragansett and Mohegans. The Treaty of Hartford was signed by the Colonists, Mohegans, and Narragansett on September 21, 1638. The colonies prohibited any surviving Pequot from calling themselves so. The Pequot War was the first time the New England Algonquin witnessed the tactics of European warfare, but it wouldn't be the last. While a tense peace between the colonists and natives would last nearly 40 years, this peace will be broken by an extremely consequential war in the 1670s. This war would be King Philip's War. Thanks for watching. The year is 1620. And a party of men walk ashore on a beach in Cape Cod, modern Massachusetts. As the men gaze in astonishment at their surroundings, an arrow flies by one of their heads. These colonists are about to find out that they are not alone in this new world. The Puritans were a religious group that not only rejected the teachings of the Catholic Church, but those of the Anglican Church as well. This would lead to harsh persecution, as was done to every religious group in England that wasn't Anglican at the time. Therefore, the Puritans decided to leave England for the New World, which had been quote-unquote discovered by Columbus 130 years prior. In July of 1620, after a brief stint in the Netherlands, the Puritans procured 2 ships, the Mayflower and the Speedwell. From Holland, the 2 ships went to England, and between August 5th and 15th, left Southampton on a voyage due west. However, before leaving, the colonists signed a document today known as the Mayflower Compact, drafting the second rudimentary form of English colonial government in the United States, with the first being that built in Jamestown. When the denizens of the Mayflower first spotted Cape Cod, it was at the end of a long and arduous 3-month journey. Upon sending a landing party, the second major interaction between Puritan colonists and Native Americans would be recorded by the first governor of Plymouth Colony, William Bradford, in his History of Plymouth Plantation, as such. It is recorded in Scripture as a mercy to ye apostles and his shipwrecked company, yet the barbarians showed them no small kindness in refreshing them, but the savage barbarians, when they met with them, were readier to fill their sides full of arrows than otherwise. The first recorded encounter between the Puritans and the Wampanoag would merely be foreshadowing of the violence to come. While the Puritans set about building their colony, called Plymouth, after the city in southern England, they were being watched, and they knew it. Interactions with the Native Americans were often brief and sporadic, until eventually a man walked out of the forest and started talking in broken English to the colonists. This man would introduce himself as Samoset, and he introduced the Puritans to the Pawtuxet diplomat, Squanto, who brokered a peace between the colonists and the Wampanoag. Squanto eventually took some of the colonists to Mount Hope, the main Wampanoag settlement, to meet the Wampanoag Sachem, or leader, and father of the titular King Philip, Massasoit. Bradford wrote on the encounter, "They found his place to be 20 miles from hence, ye soil good, and ye people not many, being dead or abundantly wasted, and ye late great mortality, which fell in these parts about 3 years before ye coming of ye English, wherein thousands of them died. They not being able to bury one another, their skulls and bones were in many places still lying above ground." This is referring to smallpox, which had and was still devastating the Native American societies at the time. Tensions continued between Massasoit and the colonists over Squanto's status. Massasoit believed Squanto was a traitor and wanted the colonists to give him up, but they refused as Squanto was their diplomat. This was resolved in March of 1623 when Massasoit fell ill and Puritan Edward Winslow nursed him back to health. establishing an alliance. In 1624, Winslow would write Good News from New England, in which he would state, Their sachems cannot be called kings, for only a few of them, to whom the rest resort for protection. Of this sort, Massasoit is our friend, and Canonicus of Narragansett our supposed enemy. In the 1630s, however, the Puritans would fight in the Pequot War alongside both the Wampanoag and the Narragansett. However, by the 1640s, the Narragansett sachem, Miantonomy, son of Canonicus, was plotting to form an alliance against the English with the Montauk of Long Island. However, Miantonomy's meeting with the Montauk was witnessed by English military engineer Lyon Gardner, who wrote Miantonomy's words. These English have gotten our land. They with scythes cut down the grass, and with axes fell the trees. Their cows and horses eat our grass, and their hogs spoil our clam beds, and we shall all be starved. Miantonomy had been forced to affirm his loyalty to the English after the Pequot War, and he felt resentment toward the colonists. He continued, Therefore, it is best for you to do as we, both Mocacs and Mohawks joining us, and we resolve to fall upon them. Miantonomy's attempts to build an alliance against the colonists failed. After Gardner submitted his report, the English outsourced killing Miantonomy to the Mohicans and their sachem, Uncas, who summarily executed Miantonomy in August of 1643. Not all the natives were against the colonists, however, and some even converted to Christianity due to the missionaries who traveled from village to village. One of these such missionaries was John Eliot, who would establish a massive congregation called the Praying Indians. These Praying Indians lived in what were called praying towns throughout New England, largest of which was Natick. Other praying towns included villages such as Panatucket, Neshope, Ug, Kuan, Nekongkupmesut, sorry for that pronunciation, and notably Wamasut, on the site of modern Worcester. Eliot even translated the Bible into Algonquin, called Memuse Wanetupanatumwe up Biblum. King Philip, born Metacom, was born at the tail end of the Pequot War, and the Pequots would be devastated as the next great leader to rise against the English would draw his first breath. However, Metacom was not next in line to succeed his father, Massasoit, who died in 1661. Metacom's older brother, Wamsutta, would become sachem upon Massasoit's death. However, in 1662, Wamsutta would be called to court and would never return, being poisoned by the colonists. This would be the beginning of Metacom's hatred for the English. The atmosphere in the early 1670s was tense, and the Puritans had become distrustful of their once allies. The Praying Indians were supposed to act like an early warning for an impending attack, but when Praying Indian John Sachem tried to report that Metacom was preparing for war in early 1675, he went disregarded. Sachem was later murdered by 3 Wampanoags named Tobias, Wampaquan, and Matashunamo. They were tried and hung in Plymouth, which led to outrage amongst the Wampanoag. These people were not English, and should have been tried by Wampanoag law. This was an infringement on the Wampanoag sovereignty, and this would not go unpunished. In 1675, the neutral colony of Rhode Island sent an agent named John Easton to meet with Metacom and learn his grievances. Easton would write many of Metacom's complaints. While his biggest qualm was the death of his brother, Metacom also believed the English were being dishonest about past agreements. He had qualms about the treatment of natives in English courts, and the belief of the word of an Englishman over that of a native. Metacom also had grievances with the proliferation of alcohol in native communities and the use of alcohol to exploit sachems in bargains, alongside the fact that the natives did not fence in their land, so the colonists just used it for cattle grazing. Metacom did not want to fight the English. He really just wanted some form of recognition of the sovereignty of the Wampanoag, along with the other native peoples of the region. However, the English would never acknowledge his sovereignty. Easton wrote, "We endeavored that, however, they should lay down to war, for the English were too strong for them. They said, then the English should do to them as they did when they were too strong for the English. Meanwhile, the governor of Plymouth Colony, Josiah Winslow, had an agent by the name of John Brown living among a native community near Swansea, Massachusetts. He noted that Metacom had fled to his ally, Canonchet, son of Miantonomy, and the Narragansett, alongside the fact that the natives of Swansea had begun arming themselves and put him under guard. Brown knew what was happening. The Wampanoag were preparing for war. Winslow attempted to sway one of the sachems in Metacom's warband, Wamsutta's widow, Weetamoo, to the English side, and apprehend Metacom before anything drastic happened, but nothing came of this. In June of 1675, a Wampanoag warband would raid and set fire to the town of Swansea, Massachusetts. This attack occurred without the knowledge of Metacom, but it would be the beginning of a particularly bloody and brutal conflict that would lead to entire villages being wiped from the face of the earth and would define New England's identity for years to come. It is June 25th of the year 1675, and the small village of Swansea, Massachusetts lies in ruins. Survivors search among the ash and rubble for their loved ones, while simultaneously fearing that those who destroyed the village, the Wampanoag, will return. However, the Wampanoag band that raided Swansea had moved on with much bigger plans. This was war. The Swansea raid had taken place without the knowledge of Metacom, but he knew its ramifications and immediately began gathering a war council. Meanwhile, the colonies of Plymouth, Massachusetts, and Connecticut had begun gathering war councils of their own, calling for a speedy and vigorous prosecution of the war. At the onset of the war, the praying Indians decided to side with the colonists, but it was hard for English soldiers to discern between allied and enemy natives. This distrust would lead to a mass dismissal of praying Indians from the colonial militias. In July of 1675, the Massachusetts General Court repealed the laws that allowed colonists to sell weapons to allied natives and rescinded their right to bear arms. By August, a law was passed limiting the distance praying Indians could walk from their towns upon penalty of death. Puritan writers portrayed the natives as quote-unquote savage or barbaric, but in reality, the fact was that the English writers simply could not comprehend native culture and behaviors, but instead chose to see them as barbaric. In John Eliot's Praying Towns, the praying Indians had to practice mostly English customs or risk being expelled from the village. Save a few native practices Eliot saw as useful regarding survival and medicine. On September 28th, a wagon train being escorted out of Deerfield, Massachusetts, would be ambushed by the Wampanoag allied Nipmuc and their sachem, Mutawamp, alongside the Pocumtuck. The wagon train was guarded by 84 militiamen, but they were overwhelmed as 700 natives rushed out of the forest. At least 40 militiamen and 17 colonists were killed in the ensuing bloodbath, known as the Battle of Bloody Brook. The initial stages of King Philip's War would see victory after victory for the natives, with colonial towns being burned throughout New England. The English government had started its own investigation into the causes of the war, sending a man named Edmund Randolph to discern the war's reasoning. Edmund recorded many New Englanders believed reason for the war's cause, stating that there were many opposing ideas for the causation of the war. Many believed that the natives were too savage to accept Christianity and English law, and blamed the Puritans for their zealousness in converting the natives. Meanwhile, others believed that the priests in the frontier had been spreading discontent in the name of France, and others thought it was because Metacom had lost land near Mount Hope, causing him to act brashly. However, the Puritan government of Massachusetts thought differently. Randolph wrote, "But the government of Massachusetts do declare that these are the great evils for which God hath given the heathen commission to rise against them." However, Randolph also saw things differently, writing, "With many such reasons, the English have contributed to their own misfortunes. The Narragansett, for the most part, had attempted to stay out of the bloodshed, but in December of 1675, the war would reach the Narragansett homeland, known as the Great Swamp. The colonists were looking for a victory, and they knew that if the war kept going against them, the Narragansett would likely join Metacom. So the colonial militia decided upon a preemptive strike into the Narragansett homeland in Rhode Island. Despite Rhode Island being neutral in the war, in December of 1675, a large English force waded into the Great Swamp. What ensued was a massacre. Prominent Boston Reverend and Judge Increase Mathers would write on the subject in his 1676 account, A History of the War with the Indians in New England. The English soldiers played the men wonderfully. The Indians also fought stoutly, but were at last beat out of their fort, which was taken by the English. There were hundreds of wigwams within the fort, which our soldiers set on fire, in which the men, women, and children were burned to death. While Canonchet, Sachem of the Narragansett, survived the massacre, many of his people did not. Canonchet fled to Mount Hope and rallied with Metacom, where they decided that if they were to win this war and truly drive the colonists out, they needed to convince more peoples to join their cause. Therefore, on a cold day in late December of 1675, Metacom finally decided on a new determination. He would go to New York, and he would consult the Mohawk with the ambition of forming an alliance. It is February of 1676, and a battle rages among an array of burning wigwams. Men caught in a ferocious melee swarm the camp as blood flows freely onto the snow, staining it red. However, this is not a battle of Europeans against Native Americans, for the Mohawk have chosen their side. Governor of New York, Edmund Andros, had warned the Mohawk that Metacom was coming to their territory to attempt to form an alliance. But what Metacom did not know was that he was walking into an ambush. Metacom's warband was decimated by the Mohawk. Metacom fled back to New England, having lost 50 men in the ambush. Despite Metacom's misfortune, raids would continue throughout New England. In February of 1676, the town of Lancaster, Massachusetts, was attacked by native forces, and a woman by the name of Mary Rowlandson would be taken captive. She wrote on the event, in her account, a narrative of the captivity of Mary Rowlandson. At length they came and beset our own house, and quickly it was the dolefullest day that mine eyes ever saw. Mary's account is an example of a captivity narrative, which was used by the colonial governments as a form of war propaganda. Mary's daughter died from infection a week after the attack, and she was held captive for 3 months, after which Mary and her surviving children were ransomed for 20 pounds, with Increase Mathers writing on the subject in his private notes. This day, Mrs. Rowlandson was by wonderful hand of Providence returned to her husband, after she had been about 11 weeks in the hands of the Indians. However, no matter how bad the natives may have treated colonist captives, native captors were treated far worse by colonial authorities. The colonial governments of Massachusetts and Plymouth saw the native peoples not as sovereign nations fighting for their survival, but as common criminals revolting against the crown, and treated them as such. Hundreds of native captives were executed, and hundreds more were sold into much worse fates as slaves in the South. The number of captives overwhelmed the prison systems, and courts established 24-hour guards to prevent escapes. Despite the influx of native prisoners, raids would befall the outskirts of even Boston and Plymouth themselves. On March 12th, Plymouth was attacked by a large force, with the city withstanding the assault. 2 weeks later, 3 more towns were attacked and burned, and the war even spread to Rhode Island, with Providence and Warwick both being sacked and burned. The war turned into a bloody war of attrition. The colonists began to conduct search and destroy operations, with Mathers describing one such operation. About 30 of ours had ventured to go up the river toward the falls at Deerfield, to see what Indians they could espy themselves, but coming found none. They found about 100 wigwams, and some English plundered goods, which they took and burned the wigwams. The English were trying to starve out the natives and make them surrender or turn on Metacom, while the natives were trying to burn the colonist towns one by one. Meanwhile, the praying Indians were reinstated into the colonial militia, and their knowledge of native tactics and warfare would prove to be a decisive factor. However, the praying Indians were not the only decisive factor, as Metacom now had to contend with the Mohawk to the west and the Mohicans to the south. Metacom was being chased into a corner. Metacom fled east from a group of militiamen and rangers led by a man named Captain Benjamin Church. Metacom's force had been further devastated by raids from the Mohicans, and Sachems were beginning to flee his alliance and make their own peace agreements with the English. The war had become a game of cat and mouse as Church tracked Metacom across southern New England, fighting battle after bloody battle. Much resentment had been built by colonists against the natives, and this would spark many atrocities to be committed against innocent Native Americans and praying Indians. In early August, a group of 6 praying Indians, 3 women and 3 children, were massacred on Hurtleberry Hill near modern Worcester by militiamen, while these soldiers were apprehended, tried, and executed due to the intervention of colonial official Daniel Gookin. Many of these such atrocities went unpunished. By August of 1676, Metacom had returned to his ancestral home of Mount Hope in modern Bristol, Rhode Island. Metacom had been backed into a corner by Captain Church. Canonchet, Sachem of the Narragansett, had been captured by the English, and, upon refusing to make peace, was executed by the Mohicans in the same fashion as his father, Miantonomy. Weedamoo died after the Battle of Taunton, where Metacom escaped with 30 of his men, while Weedamoo escaped, only to drown and have her head hoisted on a pike by Church's men. Metacom's remaining force would be ambushed by Church's men in a marsh known as Misery Swamp on August 12th of 1676. Mathers wrote on the subject. Thereupon he betook himself to flight, but as he was coming out of the swamp, an Englishman and an Indian endeavored to fire at him. The Englishman missed of his aim, but the Indian shot him through the heart, so as that he fell down dead. Metacom's head would be cut off and hoisted on a pole, much like Weedamoo's. Metacom's second-in-command, Anawan, escaped Misery Swamp and gathered a force of around 60 men, fleeing near the town of Retoba, Massachusetts, where the Church laid siege to his camp. However, Anawan had no intention of fighting and welcomed Church into his camp as a guest. Church wrote on his encounter with Anawan in his history of Philip's War. Now Captain Church had told Captain Anawan's company, as he ordered the Indians to tell the others, namely, that their lives should all be spared, excepting Captain Anawan's, and it was not in his power to promise him his life, but he must carry him to his masters at Plymouth, where he will entreat them for his life. Church took Anawan to Plymouth, where he did petition the Plymouth courts to spare Anawan's life, but the courts decided to have him executed anyway. Anawan's execution marks the end of the southern front of King Philip's War, and its ramifications were widespread. 1,000 colonists died in the war, but that pales in comparison to the 3,000 natives killed and countless sold into slavery over the course of the war. The actions of Massachusetts Bay Colony in illegally invading the colonies of Maine, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island without the permissions of those living there would spark a royal inquiry and eventually the revocation of Massachusetts' colonial charter by the king, sparking outrage and ending the United Colonies. However, the war continued in the north and would lead to Maine being nearly depopulated of colonists. It is August of the year 1676, and the town of Falmouth, Maine, lies partially destroyed. A survivor of the recent raid by the Abenaki, Thaddeus Clark, recounts the devastation in a letter written to his mother. Of the men slain, 11. Of the women and children, 23 killed and taken. We that are alive are forced upon Mr. Andrews his island, to secure our own and the lives of our families. We have but little provision, and are so few in number that we are not able to bury the dead till more strength come to us. Before the outbreak of King Philip's War in 1675, which I have a series on, the Abenaki lived largely at peace with their colonist counterparts in New Hampshire and Maine. However, when a group of Wampanoag launched a retaliatory raid against the Massachusetts town of Swansea in mid-1675, colonists in York, Maine, sent a force up the Kennebec River to demand disarmament from the Abenaki, to which they complied. Subsequently, many Abenaki starved in the following winter due to being unable to hunt. After this, many outbreaks of violence occurred between Penobscot and colonists, and the final straw was reached when colonist militiamen drowned the son of a Pequawket sagamore named Squando in cold blood. Under the leadership of Androscoggin Sagamore Mag Hagon and Penobscot Sagamore Madakawando, the Abenaki made their first raid on the town of Topsham, where they destroyed a farm on September 5th of 1675. Through September, Abenaki forces launched raids throughout Maine and New Hampshire, attacking Saco and Durham, and forcing the abandonment of a town called Winter Harbor on Mount Desert Island. In early October, 2 large battles were fought in the town of Berwick, and on October 18th, the town of modern Scarborough, then Black Point, was attacked, with 7 houses destroyed. Following this, the war died down for a time, with isolated skirmishes occurring, but not as many large-scale battles due to the winter season. On August 11th, 1676, a large Abenaki force attacked the town of Falmouth, near modern Portland, killing and capturing up to 34 settlers. This is the raid that Thaddeus Clark was talking about. On the 14th, the Abenaki attacked the best fortified settlement in the region, a trading post for the Clark and Lake Company on Aroostook Island, killing 14. The people of Maine and New Hampshire started using fortified houses called garrison houses, which would act as shelters for whole towns during raids. On September 7th, a large group of 200 Abenaki were tricked into false peace negotiations and captured, with many being sold into slavery. Following this, the Abenaki attacked Wells on the 24th, killing 3, and York on the 25th of September, killing 40 people. In November, the English retaliated by taking 9 natives captured in Machias, Maine, and 17 Micmac in Nova Scotia captive, selling them into slavery. During this time, Mag Hagon began building an Abenaki navy out of an estimated 40 sloops and about 12 30-ton ships captured from colonial militiamen. In February of 1677, the English betrayed the Abenaki at another quote-unquote peace conference, capturing several leaders and selling them into slavery. I'm beginning to see a pattern here. In April, the Abenaki attacked Wells and York yet again, killing 10. On May 13th, Mag Hagon laid siege to Scarborough. The siege lasted 3 days, with 3 colonist soldiers killed and a 4th captured. However, Mag Hagon was killed on the 3rd day, with the siege breaking following his death. After the death of Mag Hagon, the Abenaki raided York and Wells yet again, with another attack being set on York as they retreated. On June 29th, the Abenaki ambushed a large colonial force near Scarborough, killing about 60. On July 18th, in Nova Scotia, a group of 80 Micmac captured 5 English fishing boats, bringing them to Maine. The fishermen were able to stop the attack on the Penobscot River in Maine, and many of the Micmac attackers retreated overboard into the river. However, some were imprisoned. where they were brought to Marblehead, Massachusetts, and stoned to death. Following the entry of the Mohawk on the side of the English in 1677, the Abenaki sued for peace. The Abenaki negotiation party, led by Madakawando, signed the Treaty of Casco with the New York colonial government, who owned Maine at the time. Under the terms of the treaty, the English had to pay rent to the Abenaki, who returned all seized land. The English were also to respect Wampanoag sovereignty. However, the English settlers refused to abide by the terms of the treaty, which would cause a return of tensions between the two parties. The First Abenaki War was, by nearly all accounts, a Native American victory. The war left Maine nearly depopulated of English settlers for a time, and even led to the English paying the Abenaki tribute. However, as settlers returned to Maine, the old tensions flared yet again, leading to a new war. But that is a story for another day. Thanks for watching. If you made it to the end, thank you for watching this supercut of my series on King Philip's War, the most important war that you have never heard of. This war is very interesting, as it happened around 50 years after the first Thanksgiving, between the two parties that engaged in the first Thanksgiving. So think about that while you're eating your turkey dinner. Happy Thanksgiving.